Carl Jung, who I greatly admire, he believed, I think, in the same way that C.S. Lewis did, that, and he doesn't talk about this that much, but that there is this archetypal mythological pattern of the dying and resurrecting hero that has this psychological reality, which is extraordinarily deep, but that archetype was realized once in history. And that's fully realized. So it came from the mythic realm, let's say, the realm of eternal truth, the realm of pattern, instinctive pattern for that matter, and was fully realized at one point in history. And you might think, well, if it's going to be fully realized, it has to start somewhere. It can't start everywhere at the same time.
Right. What does an archetype look like when it takes flesh? Might be a way to get at that.
Well, and the thing is, we do see this, and it does grip us, because movies, like, we see representations of this all the time. In my new book, I talk a fair bit about Harry Potter, and Harry Potter is definitely an archetype
Christ figure,
taken flesh. Well, clearly he's in battle with Satan himself, obviously. I mean, and she has an unbelievably profound mythological imagination. And the thing that's so fascinating about all of that is that because her mythological imagination is spot on, she captivated the entire globe and produced this immense storehouse of wealth and dominated the entertainment landscape for a decade. And people don't take that seriously, but it's a great mystery to watch that. Absolutely, they should. It's a phenomenon. Anything that grips people's attention like that is obviously worth paying attention to. So
Lewis called them good dreams, right? So all the sort of archetypal anticipations of the gospel, they're the good dreams of the race. Or use the Jungian. I love Jung too. But what happens if that archetype of the person perfectly pleasing to God, Kant's language, what would happen if that archetype became flesh? And indeed, that's how they put it. The word became flesh and dwelt among us.
I think that's also the question we should each be asking ourselves in our own lives.
Yeah,
it's like, well, who could we be? And you say, well, you don't have to ask yourself that question. It's like, well, good luck with your conscience then.
You should be another Christ.
That's the objection to the self-created person. It's like, the idea that you can create your own values is, well, good luck.
Right.
Try.
Good luck with that project.
Yeah, good luck.
Right.
It's not going to work.
Newman referred to the conscience, I always love this, as the aboriginal vicar of Christ in the soul. So he took the language descriptive of the Pope, the vicar of Christ, but he said the aboriginal vicar of Christ
is
Newman? The conscience. John Henry Newman.
Okay, because I was thinking of Eric Neumann. So
no, John Henry Newman, and it's a beautiful way of describing it, because we'd say the Christ dwelling within you is the voice of the conscience that's calling you to sanctity, ultimately, to heroic self-sacrifice, to being who Christ is.
It also is. It is what people worship. Because here's a way of thinking about it technically. Well, look, when I have a conversation with you, there's something I want from you. I want everything you can give me. I want you to be as there as you can possibly be. That's what I'm demanding all the time. If my attention, assuming a properly constituted subjectivity, if my attention wanders, that means you're not delivering. And so if you're wandering around and everyone's attention is wandering away from you, you're not delivering. And conscience, because we're so social, we're social creatures to the final degree. Conscience tells you when you deviate from the ideal, and that ideal is what people worship. By attending to that manifestation of the ideal in you, they worship it. And so that's there. It's there in the demands that we can't help but make of each other and of ourselves. There's no escape from that. And so I do think it's a perfectly good question. What would happen? And this is the right question for your life. What would happen if you took that seriously? And so, again, what I see is that it doesn't seem to me to be, if the church can no longer attract young people, it has to be that they're not taking that with sufficient seriousness. Now,
I think there's a lot to that.
I don't want to externalize the blame. It's like, I know the church is a human organization and all of that, but it's still evidence.
When I was coming of age, so back in, like, say, the 1970s, the presumption of the church was, we should make this thing as easy as possible, because if we make it hard, these people are going to run away. So we don't want to make it, we want to make it intellectually easy. So I got a very dumbed down Catholicism. It was through the grace of God that I discovered later in life the very rich Catholic intellectual tradition. But when I was going through school, including through high school, you know, banners and balloons and collages, and it was a very superficial. We got the clearer impression when I was a kid that English and science and math and all that were serious subjects. Religion was like gym, or it was like, you know, I don't know what else, like art class or something. It was considered not that serious. So we dumbed it down intellectually, and we lessened the moral demand for sure, because we didn't want, I think, people to run away. And then, you know, I'll say it bluntly, rather pathetically, we tried to be as relevant as possible. That was the term from our time. You
right.
know,
And that's like the uncool guy at the party, man.
Right.
You know, if you have to strive to be relevant, you're not on the cutting edge. That's for sure.
Right. And so there's a study I read some years ago that I thought was very plausible. The conclusion was what young people find compelling in a mentor figure are the two things. One is that the person knows a lot about the subject that he or she is sharing. And secondly, they're really committed to it. And when the kids sense those two things, well, there's a lot to know here, and this guy or this woman, they really believe it. They find that compelling. You don't need, you know, the games of relevance. You don't need to dumb it down. In fact, smarten it up and make it as intellectually challenging and morally challenging as possible. We dropped a lot of practices that were much more common years ago, you know, to kind of draw young people into the challenge of it. So that is a problem. Absolutely.
Well, you know, one of the things that I've been so delighted by is my observation that there's a tremendous hunger for serious conversation.
Yeah.
Public hunger for it. And when I have engaged in my lectures, I'm always extending myself to my limits of thought. Like that's what the lecture is. It's an attempt to go past what I think. And there's absolutely no doubt that everyone in the audience is on board with that. I mean, it was the case when I debated Sam Harris, for example, that discussion, which, you know, was as technically complex as Sam and I could make it. And, you know, and that might not be as philosophically complex as the absolute ideal, but it wasn't dumbed down by any stretch of the imagination. And there's no reason that if you spoon feed that material, it catches no one.
And I can tell you this: those new atheists, so Sam and Hitchens and Dawkins, those guys, they were good evangelizers. I mean, for their position, I deal with young people all the time.
And they didn't dumb it down either.
They didn't dumb it down. They had the two things I talked about. They were intelligent and they were passionately committed to it. But every day on the internet, when I go into these comm boxes, I hear the phraseologies from Hitchens and Dawkins and Sam Harris. A lot of young people read them. They didn't hug them into atheism. They argued them into atheism. So I've been telling our people, we got to stop trying to hug people back into the faith. We have to argue them back into the faith. We have to make it compelling and,
I had
morally
a friend,
challenging.
I've been walking with this friend of mine and talking with him. And, you know, he said something quite interesting. He was raised in a communist country and was an atheist after that. He said his family observed Christmas, and he criticized them for that because it was logically incoherent. And then he realized that all that would happen if they abandoned Christmas was that they wouldn't have Christmas anymore. It wasn't like he had something to replace it with.
Right.
And so it's magical. You might even call it naive if you're of the sort of mind that would call that naive. But do you want to have it or not? And if the answer is, well, I'll replace it with another weekend, then that's really not helpful. And the problem with the atheists is that they don't have, the best they can offer is something like a materialistic utopia. And I've got nothing against that. Like I've been talking to people like Bjorn Lomborg and who lay out this vision of an increasingly wealthy world where absolute poverty is a thing of the past and where people can take the levels of health that are more or less taken for granted in the West, for granted everywhere in the world, through a process of incremental economic improvement. And, you know, more power to that, I think. Yeah. But I also know that that isn't a sufficient story. And there's a kind of despair that goes along with material security because the adventure is drained out of it. And Dostoevsky touches on this, and this is where I really learned this when I first encountered this idea. You know, Dostoevsky in Notes from Underground says, look, this is something you have to understand. If you gave people everything they need so that they had nothing to do but eat cakes and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, if they were so happy that nothing but bubbles of bliss would appear on the surface of the water that they were in, they would smash it all to pieces just so that something adventurous and unique could happen. And so like there has to be a call to a higher order of spiritual being, let's say, or psychological being that accompanies that materialism, or we won't even accept it.
It'll kill us. No, absolutely. It'll smother us. It's got to be the call to sanctity. And the call to sanctity is a call to love. And there, Dostoevsky, you know, love is harsh and dreadful. It's not a cute little emotion, or it's not a sentiment. Real love is harsh and dreadful because it means going into the place where people are suffering and becoming another Christ and bearing the burdens of the world. That's serious business. Love is something awful about it, you know, but when you summon someone,
there's also something awful about the judgment, you know, because if you love someone, you also hold them to a standard.
Yeah, you will their good, right? And that means holding to a standard. Do you know this? Russia triggered this in my mind. I'm reading these wonderful books by this priest, Walter Chizek. I don't know if you know that name. He died in 1984, but for 23 years, he was a prisoner in the Soviet system. So he was arrested in 1939, right when the war got going with the Germans. And make a long story short, he was in Lubyanka prison for 5 years in Moscow, basically in solitary confinement. Then he was sent for 15 years or so to Siberia, to the worst work camps, you know. And he describes it in this book called With God in Russia in this kind of bald, just straightforward way. But all through it, he says, okay, I went into Russia to be a missionary, to announce the gospel. It's not the way I expected it to be. I didn't expect to be in a prison camp, but okay, this is what God has willed, obviously. At least his permissive will is that I be here. So I'll do what I can. And so for 23 years, this man set up, when he was in solitary, a Jesuit program of prayer, and he would go through his day. He had the prayers of the Mass memorized. Then when he gets to the camps, they would smuggle in little bits of bread and wine. So he would say Mass on a little table clandestinely, you know, and he would minister in his own quiet way to the people around him. I'm telling that story because in the most horrific circumstances, in a way he never saw coming, he said, okay, but I'll try to be a saint here. I'll try to be Christ, bear the sufferings of those around me, and bring the grace of God. He was finally sprung in 1963. JFK was involved in getting him out with a prisoner exchange. As he left Russia, the plane's taking off, and he did the sign of the cross over the country, bless the country. And it's an incredibly moving story because it's not at all flashy. It's told in a really almost bland manner. But it's someone who decided, no, I'm going to go in the depths. I'm going to deal with what I've been given. And it's horrific. I'm in a Soviet Siberian concentration camp doing hard labor, but I'll be Christ for the people here. That's it. I mean, that's the adventure. There's the hero's journey that he went on.